the only people that I know who aren't are people who are unhappy in life. It's been a big disappointment to them.
He once held off enemy machine guns for more than 4 hours straight in the mountains of Korea and walked away alive. Years later, a 14-pound newborn record holder, a man who once fractured his own collarbone, set the bone himself, and finished filming the same day, checked into a hospital for one of the most routine surgeries in modern medicine. Within hours, he was dead. If that sounds backwards to you, it should. Because almost nothing about how Dan Blocker died makes sense next to how he actually lived. And maybe that's exactly why his wife, after watching the world fall in love with a fictional cowboy her husband played on television, decided the real man deserved to disappear from the public eye completely, along with herself. This is the real story behind the gentle giant who played Hoss Cartwright, and the strange, quiet ending almost nobody saw coming. Let's start with the part most people get wrong immediately. They assume a man that size, who played a character that tough, must have lived some kind of larger-than-life Hollywood existence right up until the end. The truth is almost the opposite. Dan Blocker spent most of his adult life actively running away from fame, not chasing it, and the surgery that ended his life in 1972 was supposed to be the most uneventful thing that happened to him that entire year. To understand how strange that ending really was, you have to go all the way back to where this story actually begins, in a small Texas town where nothing about Dan Blocker's birth was ordinary either. Born on December 10, 1928, in DeKalb, Texas, Dan Blocker weighed an almost unbelievable 14 pounds at birth, a record that, decades later, still stands as the largest baby ever recorded in his home county. From the very first day of his life, people simply could not stop talking about his size, and that pattern never really went away. His family lost nearly everything during the Great Depression, and his father eventually scraped together enough money to open a small grocery store in the tiny town of O'Donnell, Texas. The family lived in rooms behind the shop, and young Dan helped however he could, hauling groceries out to customers' cars, getting bigger every single year until his father started joking that customers should be paying just to come watch the boy work, since he kept accidentally breaking things around the store from sheer size alone. O'Donnell was the kind of small town where Saturday nights were the biggest event of the week, and oddly enough, Dan himself often became part of the entertainment. Word spread that if anyone wanted to test their strength against the biggest kid in town, he'd be waiting downtown for a challenge. By his own account, he never lost. As a teenager, he already weighed close to 275 pounds, confident enough in his own physical power to joke that he could beat a reigning heavyweight boxing champion if he just had a few months to train properly. That kind of physical dominance led him naturally toward football. At 13, he enrolled in a military institute and played linebacker well enough to earn a college scholarship, where he originally planned to study English. By 18, he stood over 6 feet 3 and weighed nearly 300 pounds, still growing. But it was an almost accidental moment, completely unrelated to football, that quietly redirected the rest of his life. The school's drama department needed someone strong enough to move heavy prop furniture for a stage production of Arsenic and Old Lace. Dan was the obvious choice for the job. Then, almost as an afterthought, someone suggested he step into a small supporting role in the same production. The moment he felt the audience's reaction from that stage, something shifted permanently, and he switched his major from English to theater without ever looking back. After graduating, he turned down offers to play professional football, choosing instead to chase an entirely different kind of future on the stage, working through summer stock and repertory theater until he eventually landed a small Broadway role in a production of King Lear. It looked, on paper, like the start of a promising acting career. Then history intervened in a way nobody could have planned for. In late 1950, Dan was drafted into the United States Army during the Korean War. After months of training, he was deployed to the front lines, eventually rising to the rank of sergeant while serving in an infantry unit stationed in one of the most dangerous stretches of the entire conflict. During one especially brutal ambush deep behind enemy lines, when a fellow soldier was wounded and pinned down under heavy fire, Dan held his position for more than 4 hours, returning fire against machine guns and mortars to protect his unit, even though the wounded soldier ultimately did not survive. The fighting continued through some of the war's bloodiest, most infamous battles before his division was finally pulled back from active combat. Dan, serving as acting first sergeant by that point, ended up hospitalized for wounds suffered in combat and was officially credited with helping save the lives of several men under his command. Think about that for a second, because it matters for everything that comes later in this story. This was a man who had already stared down death directly, who had survived hours of sustained enemy fire in freezing mountain terrain, who had been wounded badly enough to require hospitalization, and who walked away from all of it. One soldier who served under him later described him as strong, loud in the best way, endlessly friendly, and a natural leader, the kind of man who could crush a beer can between two fingers and still find time to check on every single man under his command. That same year, Dan married Dolphia Blocker. With a wife at his side and a new sense of responsibility, he went back to school and eventually earned a master's degree in dramatic arts. As his family grew to include twin daughters and 2 sons, he took practical jobs, teaching high school English and drama, later teaching elementary school, each move slowly pushing him further west, almost as if life itself were quietly steering him toward a destination he hadn't chosen yet. For years, acting remained something Dan genuinely loved but never treated as the center of his life. When he eventually moved his family to California, it wasn't to chase fame at all. He enrolled in a doctoral program in dramatic arts while continuing to teach, a careful, methodical decision far more concerned with stability than stardom. It was only in the mid-1950s, almost as a side project to bring in extra income, that he started auditioning for small television roles. Westerns were everywhere at the time, and a man of his size and presence fit the genre naturally. He picked up small part after small part, slowly building real experience in front of the camera, even getting passed over for a now-famous comedic role in a satirical Cold War film after his own agent turned the script down, one of those quiet might-have-beens that only makes sense decades later. Then came the moment that changed absolutely everything. A short-lived series gave him his first regular television role, and when it was canceled after a brief run, it felt like a setback at the time. In reality, it freed him up for an audition that would define the rest of his life. When producer David Dortort cast him as Hoss Cartwright on a new Western series called Bonanza, Dan made the decision to put his doctoral studies on hold entirely and commit himself fully to acting. It turned out to be exactly the right call. If the show's younger Cartwright brother brought the charm, Dan's character brought the heart, the emotional center that held the entire family together on screen. Here's something that surprises almost everyone hearing this story for the first time. Bonanza wasn't an instant hit at all. Early ratings were so weak that the network seriously considered canceling the show after just 1 season, largely because its original time slot put it in direct competition with one of the most popular programs on television. During its first year, it didn't even crack the top 30. The network believed in it enough to move it to a new night, and almost immediately, everything changed. Audiences found the show, ratings climbed steadily, and a major new sponsor in the second season gave it even more momentum. Even then, the production nearly collapsed behind the scenes purely because filming in color was extraordinarily expensive for the era, and executives had quietly planned to cancel it due to budget overruns before a network official personally intervened to keep production costs under control. That single decision is the reason Bonanza survived its shakiest early stretch and eventually exploded into one of the most beloved series in television history, with Dan sitting right at its emotional core. From the moment audiences met Hoss Cartwright, something about him clicked instantly. Here was an enormous man, well over 6 feet tall and more than 300 pounds, who somehow read as gentle rather than intimidating, awkward rather than threatening, endlessly kind rather than tough. He stumbled over his own words. He got into trouble through pure good-heartedness rather than mischief. And audiences fell in love completely. But here's the contradiction almost nobody talks about, the one that makes the ending of this story even stranger. Off-screen, Dan was almost nothing like the simple, slow-hearted character he played. He held an advanced graduate degree. He had worked as a school teacher. He was deeply religious, politically engaged, and intellectually curious, the kind of man who read constantly and thought carefully about the world. The character audiences adored was, in nearly every practical sense, the opposite of the man playing him. And yet they shared one thing completely, a deep, almost instinctive compassion that came through in every single scene. In the earliest seasons, Dan later admitted he struggled to separate himself from the role entirely, spending so much time building the character from the inside out that the line between actor and performance began to blur. It wasn't until around the show's 5th season that he finally felt confident enough to step fully into the character each morning and step completely away each night. Off camera, his toughness showed up in ways that, looking back now, feel almost like foreshadowing. During one filming session, he was violently thrown from a horse and fractured his collarbone. Rather than heading straight to a hospital, he reportedly set the bone himself, climbed back onto the horse, and finished the scene before finally taking time to properly recover. Remember that detail, because it's going to matter again by the end of this story. This was a man who treated his own broken bones as an inconvenience to work around, not an emergency. He rarely spoke publicly about Korea, but the war left a permanent mark on him, especially around firearms. Despite playing a character who carried a gun on screen constantly, Dan despised weapons in real life, a feeling that traced back to one terrifying night on a Korean mountainside that stripped away any illusion he'd ever had about feeling invincible. Before the war, he had enjoyed hunting. Afterward, he owned no guns at all and refused to let his own sons hunt, believing it was dishonest to call something a sport when only one side could shoot back. On set, Dan found something genuinely rare in entertainment: real, lasting friendship. He grew especially close with his on-screen brothers, spending long hours together on set and choosing to keep spending time together once the cameras stopped rolling. Their bond ran deep enough that Dan served as best man at one of his co-stars' weddings. Outside the show, he picked up a handful of film roles alongside one of the biggest stars in the country, but television remained his home, and the character he created there became his lasting legacy. By the mid-1960s, Dan had reached a level of success most performers only dream about. And yet, almost ironically, he had very little interest in being famous at all. He and his wife made a deliberate decision to live quietly, choosing a modest, comfortable home in an ordinary suburb rather than a lavish estate in the hills. To Dan, acting was simply work, a way to support his family, not a path to becoming a celebrity. The intense public attention that came with the role often left him visibly uncomfortable, strangers stopping him constantly, grabbing his arm, hugging him without asking. He valued his privacy in a way that became harder and harder to protect as the show's popularity exploded. The part that weighed on him most was what fame did to his children. He desperately wanted his 4 kids to feel normal, but even something as simple as getting ice cream together could turn into a small public event. Strangers staring, pointing, interrupting. He understood the admiration behind it, but that didn't make the constant intrusion any easier to live with. Eventually, the search for genuine privacy led the family somewhere completely unexpected. Dan decided to relocate them to Lugano, Switzerland, a decision that didn't come from a business strategy or tax shelter, but from something almost poetically simple: a magazine feature on the lake regions of northern Italy and southern Switzerland that stopped him cold. Years after first seeing those photographs, he finally took his family there, and somewhere along that trip, something clicked. Lugano didn't just look beautiful to him. It felt like home. The move offered exactly what he'd been craving for years: real peace, no crowds, no strangers grabbing his arm, just quiet streets and a slower pace of life. There was a strange detail that worked entirely in his favor too. His show aired overseas only in a language most people in that particular region of Switzerland didn't speak. In Lugano, almost nobody recognized him at all. He wasn't a television cowboy there. He was simply Dan, a husband, a father, a private citizen, finally able to breathe. And that brings us back to where this story started. Because in 1972, Dan returned to the United States to begin filming what would become the show's final season. Almost immediately, people around him noticed something was wrong. He felt unusually weak and drained, nothing like the seemingly indestructible man they'd known for over a decade. Concerned, he went to the hospital, where doctors determined his gallbladder needed to be removed. Here's where the story turns genuinely strange, because everything about this surgery was supposed to be routine. A cholecystectomy was, and still is, one of the most commonly performed surgeries in the entire country, completed safely on countless patients every single year. There was no reason for anyone, doctors included, to expect anything to go wrong. This was a man who had survived hours of direct combat in Korea, who had set his own broken bone in the middle of filming a television show and gone right back to work. A standard surgical procedure felt almost minor by comparison to everything he had already lived through. The operation appeared to go smoothly. Afterward, Dan felt genuinely relieved, finally free from gallstone pain that had bothered him for years. He was sent home to recover, already thinking ahead to finishing the season. Then, only hours later, without warning, everything changed. He became suddenly dizzy and complained of severe pain. His wife, alarmed, rushed him back to the hospital immediately. He never came back out. Later that same day, Dan Blocker died from a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that had traveled into his lungs and blocked a major artery. There was no slow decline, no extended battle, just a man who felt fine one moment and was gone the next. Dan Blocker was only 43 years old. Sit with the irony of that for a second, because it's almost impossible to fully process. A man who survived sustained machine gun fire in the mountains of Korea, who once set his own fractured collarbone and finished a day of filming before seeking medical attention, was killed by complications from one of the safest, most routine surgical procedures performed in America. If you had written that ending into a script, audiences would have called it unbelievable. The shock rippled outward instantly. His wife lost her partner. 4 children lost their father. His closest castmates lost a man they considered family in every sense that mattered. And audiences around the world, who had spent more than a decade watching him every Sunday night, struggled to process how someone who felt so permanent, so solid, could simply vanish almost overnight. This is the part of the story that almost nobody talks about, and it's arguably the most important part. After his death, his widow faced a choice familiar to anyone who has ever lost a public figure they loved. She could have stepped into the spotlight herself, given interviews, kept her husband's name circulating in headlines, built her own platform out of public grief. Instead, she made the opposite choice, completely and deliberately. She withdrew almost entirely from public life, focusing on raising their children, protecting their privacy, and preserving her husband's memory with quiet dignity rather than public spectacle. She never remarried. She never sought attention. She never tried to shape or rewrite the story for an audience that, by every indication, she felt had already taken enough of their family's privacy while Dan was alive. Because she avoided the spotlight so completely, much of what happened in her own later years remains largely unknown today, and that, by every indication, is exactly how she wanted it. To her, peace mattered more than public curiosity ever could. In time, she too passed away quietly, leaving behind children and grandchildren who carried forward the same values she and Dan had lived by their entire lives together. Kindness over recognition, privacy over performance, family over fame. It's worth sitting with the full shape of this story for a moment, because the irony runs all the way through it. A man who once held off enemy fire for hours in freezing mountain terrain spent the rest of his life quietly avoiding any kind of spotlight at all, deliberately choosing a modest home, a foreign country, and a low profile over everything Hollywood typically offers its biggest stars. And then, after surviving war, after surviving a broken collarbone mid-scene, after building one of the most beloved characters in television history almost by accident, he was taken by something as ordinary as a routine surgery, in a matter of hours, with no warning at all. There's another detail about Dan's final years that deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it reframes everything that happened afterward. By 1972, the show that had defined his entire career for well over a decade was already losing some of its original cast, and the network had quietly begun discussing what the future of the series might look like without certain key actors. Dan, by every account from people who worked alongside him, was approaching that final season with the same steady professionalism he'd brought to every season before it, fully intending to finish out his commitments before eventually returning to the quiet life he and his family had built overseas. He wasn't thinking about endings. He was thinking about logistics, about getting through filming so he could get back to Switzerland, back to the kind of ordinary life he'd spent years carefully protecting. That makes the abruptness of what actually happened even harder to process. There was no farewell tour, no final dramatic storyline written to send his character off with the weight the moment deserved. Production simply had to figure out, almost overnight, how to continue a show that had built so much of its emotional core around a character who was suddenly gone. The network ultimately wrote his character's death into the storyline the following season, an unusual and difficult decision that forced both cast and audience to grieve fictionally and genuinely at the same time, blurring the line between the show and real life in a way television rarely has to confront. For his castmates, the loss was especially difficult precisely because of how close they had actually become off-screen. These weren't actors who simply tolerated each other for the sake of a paycheck. They had spent years together, often from early morning until late at night, 5 and 6 days a week, season after season, building the kind of bond that doesn't form quickly or easily in any industry, let alone one built on rotating casts and short-term contracts. Losing Dan wasn't just losing a colleague. For several of them, it was losing one of their closest friends in the world, someone who had stood beside them at their own weddings, someone whose laugh they could probably still hear decades later. And then there's the part of the story that almost never gets told in full, the quiet, deliberate disappearance of the woman who had spent her entire adult life beside him. It's worth asking directly why that disappearance feels so striking, even now, more than 5 decades later. Part of it is simply how rare that kind of restraint actually is. In an industry built on interviews, tell-all books, and public processing of grief, choosing total privacy after losing someone that famous is almost unheard of. Most spouses of major stars eventually give at least one interview, write at least one tribute, make at least one public appearance tied to their loved one's legacy. Dan's widow appears to have done none of it, not because she didn't grieve deeply, but because she seemed to believe that grief, like the rest of their life together, belonged to their family and nobody else. That decision meant accepting a strange kind of historical erasure. Because she chose not to participate in interviews or public retrospectives, much of what might have been known about her own life, her own personality, her own version of their marriage, simply never became part of the public record. Fans who want to learn more about Dan Blocker today can find countless interviews, behind-the-scenes stories, and detailed accounts of his career. Almost none of that exists for the woman who knew him best, and that imbalance is entirely the result of a choice she made on purpose, not an accident of history. There's something almost instructive about that choice today, in an era where every personal tragedy seems to eventually become content, repackaged into interviews, documentaries, or anniversary specials. Dan's widow seemed to understand something that a lot of public figures never quite grasp, that protecting your family's privacy sometimes means accepting that parts of your own story will simply never be told, and choosing that anyway because it's the right thing to do for the people you're protecting. What made Dan Blocker so different from so many of his peers wasn't just his talent, though he clearly had plenty of it. It was the quiet consistency between who he was on screen and who he actually was at home, a gentle, principled, deeply loyal man who never let success change the values he carried from a small Texas grocery store all the way to a Hollywood soundstage. And what made his wife's response to losing him so remarkable wasn't silence for its own sake. It was a final act of protection, shielding their children, shielding his memory, and shielding the private life they had spent years carefully building from a public that had already cost them so much. Dan Blocker never set out to become an icon. He simply tried to live honestly, raise his children well, and bring genuine kindness to a role that could easily have been played as nothing more than comic relief. Instead, he turned Hoss Cartwright into something timeless, a symbol of decency in a rough and complicated world, built by a man who survived real combat, real danger, and real suffering, only to be taken in the end by something almost embarrassingly ordinary. A reminder that no amount of strength, history, or survival can ever fully protect anyone from the unpredictable. If this story hit you the way it hit us, let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next story like this one.